Welcome to Talking Feds, a roundtable that brings together prominent former federal officials and special guests for a dynamic discussion of the most important political and legal topics of the day. I'm Harry Littman. I remain, and our roundtable remains, in the room where it's happening. Courtroom 1530 at 100 Center Street in downtown Manhattan. The main event there last week was the long-anticipated testimony of Michael Cohen, who, notwithstanding substantial baggage, needs to carry key parts of the DA's case and corroborate other parts in order for the jury to convict his former boss. Cohen earned high marks for his overall unruffled and acquiescent manner on the stand, but the defense nevertheless nicked him in spots that they will argue should lead the jury to discredit and dismiss everything he's saying. To the surprise of many, Cohen turns out to be the last witness the DA will call, an indication that they are happy with his performance on the stand. After one more day of testimony, we are shortly to enter an endgame with closing arguments and legal instructions. To assess where the trial stands, with nearly all the evidence in and on the verge of closing arguments, we welcome three terrific commentators who all have been on the scene and closely following the trial from the courthouse. And if I can add one more distinction, a trial is a very subjective event, and experienced observers see it differently. And we've tried, therefore, in our coverage to have a variety of people who have been on the scene, and with the result this week of a whole panel of first-time guests to Talking Feds. The first time that's happened since 2020. But they are hardly rookies, quite the opposite. And they are Katie Phang, the host of The Katie Phang Show on MSNBC, and a legal contributor and correspondent on NBC and MSNBC. Welcome for the first time, Katie Phang.
Where's the applause button? Is there an applause button?
Yasmin Vossoughian is a national reporter on MSNBC, and she's been the network's front of courthouse stalwart for the Trump trial. She was previously the host of MSNBC's weekend rolling news program, Yasmin Vossoughian Reports, and is all over the network, especially during the trial. Thanks so much for carving out an hour to be with us.
Thank you, Harry.
And finally, Ben Wittes, editor-in-chief of Lawfare, senior fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institution, and I believe a continuous presence at the trial each and every day. Is that right, Ben?
Correct.
Remarkable. All righty. Let's start with the obvious. Vengeance is a dish best served cold. Michael Cohen. It seems a while ago already that he first was announced. The people call Michael Cohen. Colorful figure, has come off in the past as thin-skinned and a hothead, so lots of anticipation and trepidation, depending on what side you're on, about how he would handle himself. How has he held up in general? We'll bore down a little bit more into both direct and cross, but what's been his general impression to you and, as best we can tell, the jury?
I think he was great on direct, and I'm not doom and gloom like some other people are about his cross so far. I think he's actually held up really well on cross, and I think that's in large part because Todd Blanche hasn't done an impressive cross. Meandering is an adjective that I've used for days. It also included Susan Nicholas's cross of Stormy Daniels. That was also a meandering cross. So I have heard the naysayers on our own network at MSNBC as well as on other networks, and I respectfully disagree. I don't know if it's a product of me having been in the weeds so much in this and knowing what the evidence is. And that is a danger, right? When we do analysis as legal folks or even non-legal folks that have been in the weeds of this case and in this trial, that is a danger that perhaps we're not looking at it through the unadulterated, quote unquote, lens of a juror. But if the intent was to bring Michael down on cross because he's a serial liar, I have to yawn because we already got that out from before through Susan Hoffinger, the prosecutor's direct of Michael Cohen.
And all the witnesses on, for the prosecution.
Yeah, that Cohen perhaps is not such a palatable person to have in your life. But then I thought that maybe Blanche was making a little bit of some leeway prior to the lunch recess vis-a-vis this one even though there's several. One October 2016 phone call between him and Keith Schiller, and then handing the phone over to Trump. And so we take this lunch recess, which hurt Blanche, frankly. And then we come back and I'm thinking, he gonna get into it again. He introduces into evidence text messages with a 14-year-old kid, which go 14-year-old kid. And then he moves on. And I'm like, oh, well, womp womp, we're moving on. And so I haven't really heard it.
And we'll bore down more into that one call, which was his best hit. I mean, look, to state the obvious, we were waiting for Blanche to get his goat, and he did not get his goat, even at that most important point that you're talking about. Do you, Yasmin, you, Ben, agree that he kept his composure, stayed low-key, conceded as he had to concede, was way better than the probably purposely hyped previews of him?
I think he did better than we had expected, that anybody had expected when it came to Michael Cohen. I think we expected a lot worse than we actually got. I think he did better on that second day of Cross than he did in the beginning of Cross. I think in the beginning of Cross, he seemed a little bit more, like wanting to push things aside. And what I mean by that is he was saying things like, it seems like something I would say, it sounds like something I'd say, whereas it seems as if after the Wednesday break, right, he had some coaching from his own personal attorney, came back Thursday and said, yes, no, sir, yes, no, sir, no, sir, which obviously we all know fares better with the jury. That moment with the lunch break, I do think that was a win for Todd Blanche in that very moment, right? But what I also think, though, is we don't talk about the October 26th phone call, right? Which I hope that I wonder if they're going to bring up and redirect, right? Because it was October 26th when the money was actually transferred. It was October 26th that Michael Cohen alleges that he had the phone call with Donald Trump again. And he said, okay, go ahead, do it, take care of it, right? There was 2 phone calls, one that was 3 minutes, one that was 1.5 minutes. So I'm also wondering on redirect how they're going to kind of clean that up and if they're going to clean it up with that phone call. So what I was wondering was why the prosecution was so specific about the timing and the dates of the phone calls. And what I mean by that is, it was so long ago. And I wonder if this was a misstep by the prosecution. And you guys are the attorneys, right? So come back at me if you want. But why it is they couldn't be more kind of broad with the exact phone calls of when it happened. And I think that's something that they kind of walked into with that October 24th phone call that they could have gotten around, where it's like, it was this specific phone call at 8 p.m. on October 24th, whereas the prosecution didn't necessarily need to nail down an exact date or time of that phone call. And by doing that, he kind of got painted into a corner.
The first thing to focus on, everybody wants to focus on how Michael Cohen did, how Todd Blanche did in cross-examining him. But the first thing to stress about Michael Cohen's testimony is how little the prosecution actually needs from him. Because the overwhelming majority of what he testified to is stuff that is already there in the record from other witnesses and from documents. And the prosecution, knowing that there is a credibility problem with this witness, created a lot of redundancy in the case. And as far as I can tell, there are really only 2 things that the prosecution is relying solely on Michael Cohen for in either, there's some circumstantial material that supports these even without him, but as direct evidence. One is that Donald Trump gave the order to make the payment to Stormy Daniels. And the second and much more important one is that Donald Trump okayed specifically the reimbursement scheme and the falsification of records in connection with it. And, Michael Cohen can sustain quite a bit of damage from Todd Blanche without actually compromising the case, as long as those 2 points remain more or less intact. Now, I agree that he took a significant hit on that October 24th phone call, but there are several other phone calls, including the October 26th key phone call on that point. And Blanche so far has not laid a glove on the idea that Trump ordered the code red with respect to the reimbursement scheme. And so I think that there's a lot of sort of tempest in a teapot about the Michael Cohen testimony, just as there was, by the way, about the Stormy Daniels testimony. And I think primarily this is a documents case, and it's going to be quite resistant, I think, to sort of skepticism because Michael Cohen isn't a truthful person.
I feel better. Thank you, Ben, because I feel like I was like in the wilderness, like wandering around by myself, not feeling so negatively impacted by Cohen's testimony. I mean, he's the small bridge, very small bridge, but everything else was still intact. And so I didn't know why everybody was chicken littling everywhere around me over his testimony yesterday. I was baffled.
So how many of the people who were chicken littling about it were people who've actually spent 2 weeks in the courtroom?
And let me just say why that is important, because you're looking, it's inevitable, I think, for cable coverage, whatever, that a sort of something stands out. He hit him. And so that becomes the focus. But for the jury, it may wash over pretty quickly. And I think Cohen kind of credibly just didn't make a big deal of it, seemed a little confused. I want to speak to Yasmin's point, though, about I think there was a prosecutorial malpractice here, because, look, they prepared him, we know 25 days. Either they knew, had put together this series of texts about the 14-year-old and the follow-on phone call right after on the 24th, or they hadn't. If they hadn't, so shame on them, and they should have. If they had, a lot of prosecutors take the general practice of not giving other information except just the witness's testimony. But here, they let him walk right into that right cross because he testified expressly, and they knew he was going to, that it wasn't a call to Schiller. So it's even a little bit more pointed in terms of that actual event on the 24th. He says, A, it was to Trump, and B, it wasn't to Schiller. And at best now, it's to both of them. There's a very strategic question now whether they try to just gloss over it quickly or really, bring home that it wasn't Cohen's problem, but that then points the finger at them. Ben, I want to go back to your point and the notion that there's these few things he has to carry alone. One way to think of that is that any kind of reasonable doubt, and I think this is the sort of Chicken Little feeling that we were hearing, Katie, goes to that. In other words, well, if he got this one wrong, maybe he got the rest wrong. Or the other way of looking at it, we have this whole narrative now. What are we really supposed to believe? That somehow this whole story by Cohen is made up, and that what? That Weisselberg and Cohen did this on their own and never told Trump. In other words, even though there are these important missing pieces, there's a narrative with momentum that you have to have a reasonable doubt kind of unstitch so much else of the case.
Yeah, but look, I mean, this is the kind of thing you can clean up a certain amount of this in redirect. You can also clean up a lot of it in summation. And the story that the prosecution's going to be able to tell in summation is there is this string of phone calls, one of which, by the way, is the morning that he then does all this banking to make the payment to Stormy Daniels. One of which is he receives a text from Melania, could you call DJT right away, please, or something along those lines. There's no doubt that they're texting and that they're in touch in the immediate period that he's making these arrangements. There's no good reason to disbelieve his general account of this, which is that he was keeping Donald Trump apprised of exactly what he was up to. The only question is whether this one specific phone call pertains to that, or whether in the midst of this, he gets in touch with Keith Schiller about the 14-year-old who's harassing him in addition. Now, I am perfectly willing to believe that the defense has raised more than a reasonable doubt about that phone call. That is, they've shown that we should attach no probative value to that phone call. And so you scratch that one off the list and go down to the next phone call. I still don't think they've raised a serious question about the larger question of why Cohen is doing this banking, making these payments, and having a string of communications with Donald Trump and the people right around him. I cannot think of another explanation for that other than the one that he proffers.
Well, and that's why I feel like those October 26 phone calls are so important. And it's one of the reasons, obviously, why the defense didn't bring it up, right? Why they focused on the October 24th phone call, but why also I feel like that was part of the prosecution's kind of misstep, and that they were so targeted with which phone calls Michael Cohen communicated what, right? And I think it would be perfectly believable if they had communicated it in a way where they weren't so specific about exactly what conversations were had on certain dates. I mean, I don't think necessarily you need to prove a case by having exact times and dates of phone calls or communications that were had. The one thing, though, I would also say is, I mean, it's going to come down to the documents. This is like what I've been saying the whole time. And if redirect goes all the way back to the documents and says, okay, well, tell me about, Exhibit 35, when Alan Weisselberg is writing grossing up to $420,000. Like, it is huge for the prosecution, that one exhibit, or this man who for how many years went to Donald Trump on everything, right? Going back to the relationship that they had, even though in the beginning of direct, they built this idea of a man loyal to Donald Trump, going back to the relationship that he had, and said every time he did something for Donald Trump, every time he kind of cleaned up on aisle 5 for Donald Trump, he would go to Donald Trump, communicate to him so that Donald Trump could say attaboy, right? Like, that's what he was gaining from that relationship. And so I wonder if they're going to bring that in, especially when it comes to their closing arguments, to kind of show the jury here, maybe there's some questions about certain phone calls here and there, but do you really believe this guy's not going to communicate with Donald Trump to get an attaboy, especially out of him, when he's cleaning up the Stormy Daniels situation?
Yeah, can I serve that up to you, Katie, with a little bit of a combination of what Ben and Yasmin have just said? So I'd wonder, I mean, this is really for all of us, but am I right? You've done some defense work, is that right?
Yeah, I have, as a criminal defense attorney.
Yeah, so what story does remain for the defense to try to tell? And then as to Yasmin's point, if it goes to documents, all right, I think it's pretty clear through Cohen's testimony, the documents are false. That's different than saying that the falsification was done by Trump with the intent to commit or conceal another crime, which is how things would bump up to a felony. So I just wonder what your thoughts are, putting your defense cap on, about what story they tell generally and how they bring home especially the intent aspect of Trump and the paper.
Yeah, so I think the misdemeanors are done. I think that the falsification, I said this the other day to somebody, it's almost like a strict liability crime. They've been falsified. It's done, right? So I still think that the defense can still hang its hat on the intent component of this when it comes to the mens rea on Donald Trump, because you still need Cohen for that still, right? Because you're never going to hear it from Weisselberg, because Weisselberg could have been your direct evidence testimonial witness to say that I spoke to Donald Trump about teeing up the bullshit reimbursement scheme. If Weisselberg had rolled in and said, to hell with Donald Trump, I've been sitting in Rikers for a while, let's have a conversation, I think it would have been better than Cohen. Because remember, Cohen goes into the Trump Tower meeting with Weisselberg. And yeah, we have the Weisselberg annotations, the Michael Cohen annotations. That exhibit is a damning exhibit. But then they walk down the hallway to Donald Trump, and it still sounds great for the prosecution. And then they walk in, and who says that Trump says, yeah, this is kosher, but Michael Cohen, right? So I think that's when the credibility component of Michael Cohen kicks in. It's, do you believe Michael Cohen when he says that Trump blessed the 420 gross up on a 130? Now, how does Cohen get buttressed with the micromanaging, penny pinching, miserly Trump who looks at everything and, according to even Madeleine Westerhout, signs all the checks, and he has to be all in the know, and he's such a, I called him an Ebenezer Scrooge, that he made sure that he sees where every ducat goes, right? So there is the corroborating other evidence that comes in through the other witnesses as well as other circumstantial evidence. But I think that's what you harp on. I think to elevate it to the other felony, I also think too, to Ben's original point and to another conversation we were having before we even hit record, which is the elevation. Do you have to prove the secondary offense or the subject offense beyond and to the exclusion of every reasonable doubt as well, which you don't. But if we're getting this energy of focusing on campaign finance violations, you still have to show that Trump kind of knew, right? That what he was doing was to end run those campaign finance laws. So how do you get there if you only get there through Michael Cohen? So if I'm the defense, that's what I do. Whether legally it's a totally sound argument, I don't have to be totally legally sound. That's up to Mershon to gatekeep me, right? Otherwise, if I can create some doubt in a juror's mind that Trump may have signed it, but he's just eating shit signing it because that's what he's doing because he's not paying attention, then I got my reasonable doubt right there.
Although a couple little points I just want to add and then see what Yasmin and Ben think about. I think we're really at a very key point. But there's a little bit more. There's a tweet from Trump asserting that the arrangement is all a retainer, which he has to know is false. And there's the testimony from Hope Hicks that he told her that Michael Cohen did this out of the goodness of her heart, which she didn't believe. So we're getting a little bit closer, maybe even a lot closer to the goal line in his knowing that, a phony baloney cover was concocted for this. Now, is that enough?
So I would say, first of all, whether it's enough is a matter of unanimity among the jurors. Jury behavior is impossible to anticipate because you're dealing with 12 people you don't know. And in this case, we've tried to sort of made a point of trying not to get to know them. So look, the relevant question to me is what's the argument that the prosecution is going to be able to make in summation, and what's the argument that the defense is going to make in summation? It seems to me the prosecution's argument is the following. Number one, that Michael Cohen says the president-elect on January 17th calls him into his office and says, I hear you're upset. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to fix it. Calls Alan Weisselberg in and says, fix it. And Alan Weisselberg then brings in his notes and shows them to Trump, and Trump okays the reimbursement scheme. Secondly, Trump describes it in public as a reimbursement scheme. Third, all the documents say retainer, which does not exist. There is no retainer. All the documents say these are for legal services. Nobody has suggested that any legal services were performed, and Michael Cohen says there were no legal services performed. Fifth, Donald Trump signs all the checks. And when you put all of that together, it is pretty hard, in my view, to say he was sort of ignorant of this scheme that was entirely done for his benefit, but maybe he was just the sort of absent-minded czar at the time. That's the argument they're going to make. The flip side argument is going to sound something like this. And here we have to go back to the payment, right? So the payment itself was just business as usual for AMI. There was no conspiracy to interfere with the election. And by the way, if there was a conspiracy to interfere with an election, that's called democracy. That's no crime. So get out of your head the idea that there was something nefarious going on. Elections are about influencing people. They weren't trying to do that, but if they were, it's no problem. Number two, this is the lying sack of shit defense. Michael Cohen is a lying sack of shit, and Stormy Daniels is a lying sack of shit. There was no sexual encounter. Everything Michael Cohen tells you about the reimbursement scheme is all bullshit from the lying sack of shit. So don't believe anything either of them say that pertains to motive.
And a very quick interjection is that's a hard road to hoe with Stormy Daniels, complete lying sack of shit, that they've taken on unnecessarily. It shouldn't have mattered, but they're now going to have to carry it.
And I suspect, by the way, that that's not Todd Blanche's fault, that this was at the insistence of the client, but I don't know that for sure. And then third, and the key one, is the sometimes a lawyer is just a lawyer defense. Michael Cohen was the president's personal lawyer. He was paid as a personal lawyer. And anything he says about this being a reimbursement scheme is bullshit. See the previous lying sack of shit defense. So there is no record falsification. So there's no record falsification. And by the way, even if there is a record falsification, there's no step up because there's no illegality either in the underlying effort to influence the election or in the tax stuff. And there's a lot that skips over, but all you need to do is get one juror to express one reasonable doubt on one of those components, and then you have not an acquittal, but a hung jury.
Two things that I am thinking about, Ben, when you kind of presented your closings for both sides is, one, don't we feel like they kind of tackled the retainer situation or the retainer issue in Cross, especially when Blanche said to Cohen, I mean, you don't necessarily need to have a retainer agreement. Is this something normal? And Cohen said, no, we don't necessarily need to have a retainer. You never had one. I remember during direct, I circled that big and I was like, that's a big moment, right? That there's no retainer agreement and yet it's being called a retainer in the document. But then Blanche went at it in Cross and said, you don't necessarily need to have a retainer. And Cohen, said to Blanche, yes, you're right. We don't usually have retainers for all these type of work. The other thing I was thinking is when it comes to sexual encounter, despite the fact that there's overwhelming evidence to suggest that Donald Trump and Stormy Daniels had sex back in 2006, I wonder if the jury even needs to believe necessarily that they had sex to decide whether or not he falsified the document. And it goes back to whether or not Stormy Daniels should have testified. I'm in the camp that I do believe Stormy Daniels should testify, and I believe that her testimony was important for the trial. But nonetheless, I don't necessarily believe a juror needs to believe that they had sex in order to believe that Donald Trump falsified the document.
Remember, they paid Dino the doorman, even though they didn't think his story was true. So that's what they do. They just pay this off. I mean, but that also, if you're the defense, Ben, that also goes to NDAs are totally kosher. People do it all the time. They're not illegal, right? So who cares if we paid these people off, if they were telling the truth or not? That act in and of itself isn't illegal. It's the end running campaign finance laws or tax laws or whatever that subject offense is the problem.
And that's how the case could have and should have been tried. My guy's sleazy, but that doesn't make him a criminal, as I think Katie could assert. But Donald Trump, wouldn't let the case be tried on those terms. So the Stormy thing is I agree totally, by the way, with Yasmin. The jury wants to see her. But now it's just an extra weight that Trump has to carry. And if they conclude he's lying there, it's hard for them to give him a clean bill of health otherwise.
So on the retainer point, Blanche was being exceptionally slippery there. And I assume he will get called on it in either redirect or in summation, because Cohen didn't have a retainer agreement while he was an employee of the Trump organization. You never have a retainer agreement with your employer. But in 2017, he is no longer an employee of the Trump organization, and he is billing them as though there were a retainer, which there still is not. That's fraud. It's one thing to not have a retainer when you're not sending bills saying, I'm billing you for legal work pursuant to my retainer agreement. It's quite another thing to not have a retainer agreement when you're not an employee and you're sending bills for legal work that you say you have not done based on a retainer agreement that doesn't exist. And so I actually think Blanche was being really slippery there, and he's gotten away with it so far. But I assume that Hoffinger will call him on it on redirect.
I think that's such a good point, Ben. What I would say, though, is as the only civilian on this podcast right now, non-lawyer on the podcast.
I'm a civilian, too.
He's a civilian.
I am not a lawyer either.
We always mark when the first person says, I am not a lawyer on Talking Feds.
I am not now and never have been a lawyer.
I always thought you were a lawyer. My gosh, look at me.
No, I'm a total fraud.
He's a better lawyer than many lawyers, though. But anyway, go ahead.
We're all potential frauds at the end of the day. No, the only thing I was going to say was, I wonder, though, what sticks with the jury, right? And this goes back to, the conversation that we had about the moments that stick with the jury. And I wonder if, because for me, the moment that stuck was that I didn't even think about what you just said, honestly. I thought, well, because you're absolutely right. Yes, he was no longer an employee of the Trump organization. But when it happened, I thought, Well, there goes that huge smoking gun of a retainer that Todd Blanche just talked about, right? So I wonder if the jury, like me, that may not be something that they necessarily stick with unless they go back in the transcript to kind of understand that point, if that's important to them. And again, it goes back to that October 24th phone call again, because that was such a big moment. If that's something that has been seared into the jury's mind, and or if they can clean it up and redirect and summations as well. But that's more of what I'm speaking to, is what sticks with them.
But this is why it's good to have two lawyers on the jury who know what retainer agreements are and know what invoices look like and know how you actually get paid as a lawyer. I know a lot of people think having those lawyers on the jury was a bad move. But when you think about it, Ben just said when you're in-house counsel for an organization, of course you don't have a retainer agreement. You have an employment agreement that dictates your compensation. These folks that are big law lawyers, they know all about retainer agreements, and they're going to know that you don't submit an invoice and get 35 grand with nothing billed for it. They know that.
I agree with you, Katie, but it's also a mixed bag because when it comes to this tricky intent issue we were talking about, a regular jury without lawyers might say, whatever, but lawyers could really push on it. Second, it's really important. We've been comparing Stormy Daniels. They had a great, maybe the best examination in the entire trial so far has been the redirect of Stormy Daniels. And I think we should really expect a good, crisp, almost cross-like, non-meandering cleanup of a redirect. And that, I think, will change the dynamic.
Can I ask a question, Harry, before you move on? Are they holding things off for redirect? Are there things that they don't even want to bring up in their direct that they want to reveal in redirect? Or is redirect always based solely on whatever the defense goes for first?
Yeah, it's a great question. By law, it is, and it certainly would be dodgy to just assume they'd bring it up and then we'd say in redirect. But you're right, because it has a sort of impact. I think in general, at least with Stormy, it wasn't like they made new points. It was these 6 things they said were wrong. And by the way, the lawyer kind of lied to you. I think that was really effective. So at different times, we've been in the courtroom or not, and the difference is being able to see the jury. I agree with Ben generally, 12 persons, good and true. Good luck with that when you only need one reasonable doubt vote. But they have been especially inscrutable, it seems to me. They are self-aware of the sort of importance of this trial. They file in single file. At this point in any trial I've ever been involved in, there'd be some jurors talking to each other, a little bit of dynamics you could read. They are notably blank slate.
There were 2 jurors up front, I remember, who did a little bit of chatting at one point. That was really kind of the only interaction I saw was like, these 2 jurors that were up front in the front row. But I think you're right. They're really not kind of showing any interaction. Someone who's on the outside for the majority of the time, most of what I'm communicating is like, whether or not they're paying attention or not, like whether or not they've gotten exhausted with this line of questioning and wanting to move on, right? Like I saw a lot of that with Stormy.
Which matters,
right? Because they were super intent, obviously, when they talked about the night in 2006, when they first met, and then kind of when they got into the afterwards of that and the lead up to the payoff, they seemed kind of less interested.
And the end of the Cohen direct, they were focused. Yeah.
They were focused. Exactly.
All right. It is now time for a spirited debate brought to you by our sponsor, Total Wine and More. Each episode, you'll be hearing an expert talk about the pros and cons of a particular issue in the world of wine, spirit, and beverages.
Thanks, Harry. In today's spirited debate, we whip through the whiskeys to find out the difference between the 3 main types, Scotch, bourbon, and rye. Whiskey, spelled without an E, is produced in Scotland and Canada, whereas whiskey, spelled with an E, means it's produced in the US and Ireland and includes Scotch, bourbon, and rye. It's these grains that help define which type of whiskey it will become before it eventually lands among the thousands of bottles on the shelves at your local Total Wine and More. Now, let's talk about Scotch. Scotch is typically made from malted barley blended with other grains, and that helps give it a little bit of a bite, making it more in an acquired taste. Bourbon must be made from at least 51% corn, produced in the US and aged in new charred oak barrels. The oak gives this brown liquid its signature sweet flavor. And then there's rye, which must be made from at least Yep, you guessed it, 51% rye. Rye is a type of grass in the wheat family that has a spicy, edgier flavor, adding a little extra kick you may not find in a bourbon. For a true test of bourbon versus rye, we recommend you pop into Total Wine, maybe grab a bottle of scotch while you're here. But to really get to know the differences in scotch, bourbon, and rye, start by talking to the guys at Total Wine and More, who are more than happy to talk day or night about whiskey, with or without an E.
Thanks to our friends at Total Wine and More for today's A Spirited Debate. Let's take a minute about what's coming before summations, and in particular, this suggestion on it. Katie, did you have any thought? What would a defense attorney want to do with Bob Costello, which seemed like the most mobbed up moment to me in the trial? But they're talking about maybe putting him on, talking about, you're shaking your head. You think we're done with witnesses?
Well, yeah, I mean, NBC News reached out to Bob Costello and he advised us that he has not been subpoenaed, he hasn't been contacted or asked to testify, but he'd be happy to do so. If I'm the defense, I don't call him because the only value out of Costello would have been his testimony that Cohen said he didn't have anything of value to use against Donald Trump purportedly. But I thought that the direct examination line of questioning with Cohen about Costello was one of the worst for Donald Trump. It could not have sounded worse saying, hey, sleep well. You've got friends at high places and Giuliani's back channeling shit to Donald Trump. It just smacked of mob-like behavior. So if I'm the defense, I don't want to stir that hornet's nest at all. I would not call Costello. All of that being said, if Trump insists on calling him, maybe he'll testify, but I don't think so. And I'm still on the fence about the FEC expert as well, considering how Mershon has restricted what the guy can say. I don't even know if the defense puts him on as well.
Yeah, play this out a little. So what Smith would be able to testify to, if anything.
So the former Bradley Smith, a former commissioner from the FEC, is a defense quote unquote expert. I don't deny that the guy has training and experience to actually qualify as an expert witness, but Mershon has ruled pretrial, and he said again on Thursday when they were arguing about it after the jury was excused that Smith can't testify as to whether or not there was something that was wrong here. And so what's the point as the defense to put him on if he can't define certain things or if he can't opine on the legality of what happened? I just think that he muddies the waters in a way that doesn't help the defense. I think that he just kind of is just a place marker for a non-event. So if I were the defense, I wouldn't call him, considering how Mershon's not going to likely change his mind about the scope of his testimony.
It's always a little tricky at this point. We take it it's axiomatic to me that Trump won't testify, but it's usually the case that the defendant doesn't testify. I think it's hard for us to overestimate how much a jury is kind of thinking and expecting. But when the defense goes into a closing summation with this posture, they've proven nothing, we don't need to show anything, etc., a single witness saying something kind of small, I think actually only diminishes from there. I think they have to sort of go all in on, they haven't laid a glove on us. And unless they've got something really good, they're better off just saying, we rest your honor and we're ready for argument.
I think it would be a mistake for the defense to call Bob Costello. And I think if the prosecution, if anything, if the defense were to call Bob Costello, I think the prosecution would welcome it, because I think they did a pretty good job in covering why Michael Cohen wasn't truthful with Bob Costello, and that Bob Costello was a pretty slimy guy, right? They asked him, did you tell Bob Costello that Donald Trump had sex with Stormy Daniels? He said no. And they talked about why they didn't tell him the truth. And he's like, because he's Rudy Giuliani's friend who's buddies with Donald Trump, and he's going to tell him everything. And Donald Trump was his client at the time. So there's no way I was going to be truthful with Bob Costello. And I didn't end up even retaining him as my attorney at the end of the day. And so I feel like the prosecution already has a fairly strong cross if they were to call Bob Costello to the stand. I can't imagine they're going to do something like that. I think it's opening them up way too much to vulnerabilities by calling him to the stand. And quite honestly, Bob Costello seems like geared up and ready to go, which, again, not a lawyer here, but I feel like when you have a witness like that, it's probably not necessarily a good thing.
All right, let me ask about a few missing persons that I think, anyone here ever been on a jury? So Ben hasn't, I haven't, I always want to be, but I've seen exercises through one-way mirrors. I think they think a lot about what hasn't been presented to them.
I was on a jury of veneer panel with Eric Holder.
Oh, wow.
There you go.
It was great. There were three of us who knew each other on that panel. It was me, Eric Holder, who had been Deputy Attorney General, U.S. Attorney, and a judge in that court.
Exactly. Superior Court, right, at the court.
And who was about to be named Attorney General. This was
Right.
right during the Bush-Obama transition. And then a guy named Harvey Rishikoff,
Sure.
who you may know. And Holder, the judge took one look at Holder and burst out laughing and dismissed him. I was the last person cut, and Harvey was the foreman of the jury.
Wow, there you go.
So there you go. DC story.
That's a great DC story. In my experience, a lot of thought about who they haven't seen. So let me just throw some names out there and tell me, what role, if anything, they play. Alan Weisselberg, Keith Schiller, Melania Trump, who wasn't going to be a witness but has been an absent the entire trial. How do those people play, if at all? Because obviously the judge will instruct, evidence only, etc. But are they important dramatis personae, do you think, at this point, or just, completely set to the side?
Well, Weisselberg certainly is, because he is the key actor and in the actual falsification of records. The scheme is, by Cohen's account, his idea. The execution is at his direction. And it is therefore conspicuous that he's not there. There's a good reason why he's not there. First of all, because he's in jail for perjury. And secondly, because neither side is calling him. The prosecution, because they're afraid he'll lie, and the defense, because they're afraid he'll tell the truth. And so there is a kind of weird equilibrium here. Nobody kind of knows what he's going to say. The prosecution tried to get in his separation agreement from the Trump organization, which they think with some justice explains why they can't call him, because it has an explicit provision that he's forbidden without compulsion to talk to law enforcement on threat of losing $750,000 or $1 million or something.
And by the way, that doesn't mean he can't testify, but it means he can't have. What we really found out, and it was important, is the DA is scared to put him on, not knowing what he's going to say, and that's what they can't find out, right?
And so, I think there's a very good reason for it, and it's a delicate situation, but the fact is that the jury's not going to hear the reason. And so from their point of view, I don't think they're going to get a missing witness instruction, but they are going to have a missing witness, and they're going to kind of instruct themselves as to what to make of that. And I wouldn't be surprised if one of them says, hey, wait a minute, you've got this scheme that 3 people in the world know about and are party to. We've heard from one of them who we know to be a liar. The second one's a defendant. A third one is the chief financial officer of the organization. We don't know that he's also a perjurer, but okay, why don't we hear from him? And I could see people holding that against the prosecution. I don't think Melania's lack of presence will be a significant issue. I am disappointed personally that the prosecution did not call Keith Schiller.
He's been like in Margaritaville, ducking them like crazy, but it's true. He could in a second substantiate Stormy beyond,
and also a whole lot of the Michael Cohen testimony about him reaching Trump through Keith Schiller, even if he only does what Hope Hicks did, which is confirm basic facts and stay very loyal. Those basic facts are highly corroborative of the prosecution's case, and I think it's disappointing that he is not there.
Although it's a good lesson, I'll make a final prosecutor's point, which is they got to play with the hand they're dealt. I just want to say we're about out of time. Katie's got to do a show that I hope to be on, if she'll still let me. I wonder if we could just end by going around the horn and, 12 people, you never know, reasonable doubt, one juror does it. But is everybody here think this is right now the prosecution's case to lose? I'll start. Yes.
Assign probability. I would say about 65%. 2-1-ish.
I mean, I think the prosecution built a really strong case. As I said earlier, I think it's going to be about the redirect for Michael Cohen. It's going to be about closing arguments as well. At the end of the day, we don't know what resonates with this jury. And this is something I was talking about with one of the other anchors the other day, which is I know so much about this. I've been covering Donald Trump for so long. I can't sometimes decipher the details of what I've learned in this case so far in this trial to what I already knew. Right? There have been times where I'm like, did I know this already? Or did this just come out in the trial? So going into this kind of eyes wide open for me is obviously a lot different than many of these jurors who don't live their lives understanding the legal troubles of the former president of the United States. And so by taking that into account, as strong of a case that the prosecution has built, what might resonate with one of these jurors because maybe they have had a similar type of relationship with a boss or, a wife that cheated or a husband that cheated. Who knows what it is that resonates with them, that they might be the one individual that turns it into a hung jury. The one other thing I would say before you moved on, which is I do think Alan Weisselberg and Keith Schiller are big MIAs. Because when you think about Keith Schiller standing outside of Donald Trump's room when Stormy Daniels was inside, you think about the phone calls, you think about Alan Weisselberg and how much a party he was to the falsification of the documents and setting up the repayment and the reimbursement. I mean, it's a big MIA for the prosecution.
And whom does the jury blame for it?
If they understand that the burden of proof is on the prosecution, they blame the prosecution. Does the jury even understand that concept of burden of proof? I mean, most Americans are fairly smart, but it's not necessarily a concept we all know about, right? So if they understand the burden of proof is on the prosecution, then they blame the prosecution. Now, I think I said this to Katie the other day. I know the burden of proof is on the prosecution, but the defense could easily have called Alan Weisselberg if they felt like Alan Weisselberg could have corroborated the case that they're making just to make it a, hole in one, we won, right? And I know that they wouldn't necessarily do that because it's not their job to have to call Alan Weisselberg to the stand. But if Alan Weisselberg, if his truth was thinking the prosecution's case, it might be something that they would want to do in lieu of Donald Trump testifying. They're not doing that either. And the jury may very well consider that despite the fact that the burden of proof is on the prosecution because they don't necessarily understand the system of law.
Last word to Katie Phang.
So the misdemeanors are a layup and the jury unanimously finds for the misdemeanors. I think the bigger question mark is whether they end up being lesser included offenses for consideration for the jury or if it becomes an all or nothing proposition, meaning both the prosecution and the defense submit to the jury only the felonies and nothing else. If that's the case, then I think that you have a very strong probability of having a hung jury.
Wow. Okay. And very good point. And I just want to say there's a great strategic question for the defense ahead about whether they ask for a lesser included offense and actually go for the misdemeanors and play that as a victory. And I'll say one final thing, which is we saw some evidence come in like the paralegals. It's just like, what the heck was that? But it's Ben's point. They were thinking already about the summation and those we're going to see calls read through and evidence that's going to be some of the best stuff. And otherwise, we are out of time, but our prognostication skills will be revealed soon.
By Ben and I doing this podcast, Harry, does that mean we've gone to law school?
You've already gone to law school. Cut the crap. Res ipsa loquitur, and we are out of here. Thank you so much to Katie, Yasmin, and Ben, and see you in court.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye-bye. We're out of time. Thank you so much, Katie, Yasmin, and Ben. And thank you very much, listeners, for tuning in to Talking Feds. If you like what you've heard, please tell a friend to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts or wherever they get their podcasts. And please take a moment to rate and review this podcast. You can also subscribe to us on YouTube, where we are posting full episodes, talking books, and bonus video content. You can follow us on Twitter at TalkingFedsPod, and you can look to see our latest offerings on Patreon. Talking Feds is still a completely independent production, so if you like the work we do and are inclined to support the show, joining our Patreon is the best way to do it. You can now leave voicemails with your questions for me and our guests. Whether for Talking 5 or general questions about the inner workings of the legal system for our sidebar segments, all you have to do is call 727 279-5339 and leave a voice message. And you can still also email us your questions at questions@talkingfeds.com. Thanks for tuning in, and don't worry, as long as you need answers, the feds will keep talking. Talking Feds is produced by Catherine Devine, associate producer Meredith McCabe, sound engineering by Matt McCardle. Our research producer is Zeke Reed. Rosie Dawn Griffin and David Lieberman are our contributing writers, and production assistance by Akshaj Turbailu. Our music is, as ever, by the amazing Philip Glass. Talking Feds is a production of Delito LLC. I'm Harry Littman. Talk to you later.